Okay. So on last class, we talked a little bit about cellular respiration and the process by which we acquire energy. This process takes place in animals, and we're basically harnessing the energy that is in our foods, the chemical energies in our foods, in order to get energies into our bodies. And so we took a look at cellular respiration, also known as aerobic respiration. And we highlighted the stages that are involved in cellular respiration. The summary here for aerobic respiration was that this process occurs over 3 stages, right? And again, this is basically your body's metabolic process in order to break down the foods that we eat in order to release energy into the body. And so we said that this process occurs over 3 stages. Okay, most importantly, we said that the final stages of this process requires the presence of oxygen. And so we left off last class looking at what happens in those final stages and how much ATP was generated. Collectively, we said that the aerobic respiration from the metabolism of one molecule of glucose gave us a total of about 36 ATP units. Okay, so the first stage in that process was glycolysis, and it took place out in the cytoplasm. And we said that this process can get started whether or not oxygen was present. It did not require oxygen to be present, okay, out here in the cytoplasm. However, for the final 2 stages of cellular respiration to take place, it takes place in the mitochondria, this is an oxygen-dependent reaction. And so as long as oxygen is present, we saw this pathway of what would happen after we consume some food. Those glucose molecules will be transported into the cell, and the process starts with glycolysis, right? Glycolysis is not the most efficient energy producing pathway because it's only going to produce about 2 molecules of ATP. There's an intermediate molecule that's produced from the initial breakdown of glucose, and that is pyruvate. And so that pyruvate will then continue to be further reduced or oxidized in the mitochondria here, as long as there's oxygen present. Okay, now we're going to take a look today, and so we call this whole entire process aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration starts with glycolysis out in the cytoplasm, and it continues into mitochondria with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain with some very optimal production of ATP in the presence of oxygen. We're going to take a look today at the other end of the spectrum and what happens during this energy production pathway when there is no oxygen present. Okay, in the absence of oxygen, the pathway takes a different turn, and it turns into a process that we call fermentation. Okay, write down that word, fermentation. Fermentation is also known as anaerobic respiration. Okay, so at this point, we want a point of comparison for aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration in terms of where does it take place, what are the required key players. And so we stopped last class with these checkpoint questions. Hopefully you've submitted yours. So today we're looking at anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is a process that's used by mostly prokaryotes. Okay, these are single-celled organisms. Okay, this process takes place in the absence of oxygen, and this is how the cells generate ATP through glycolysis and fermentation. And so we'll see here that the ATP that's generated in anaerobic respiration is a very small amount, and it's only that which is generated during glycolysis, right? And so this process of fermentation is the breakdown of carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen, okay? You should be able to define that and contrast that to what we saw with aerobic respiration, okay? The breakdown of those carbohydrates in the presence of oxygen. Okay, so by definition, we're saying that fermentation is the breakdown of carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen, okay? So anaerobic respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. And again, we said that this is a process that's mostly used by prokaryotic organisms, okay? So just visualize with me, if you will, the physiology or the makeup of prokaryotes. These are small single-celled organisms. They're not very complex at all. So you can imagine that their requirement for energy is going to be a lot less than those larger, more complex eukaryotic organisms, okay? And so it'll make sense that there's not much ATP produced during fermentation, okay? In fact, we're only going to get those 2 ATP molecules that were produced in glycolysis as our energy output during fermentation. Okay, so there's not as much ATP produced. We're yielding those 2 ATP molecules per 1 glucose from glycolysis, right? And we already said that glycolysis was that first stage of fermentation, just like we saw in aerobic respiration. Okay, glycolysis yields 2 ATP molecules, and this is in fact enough energy for some single cell organisms to carry out their, metabolic processes. And so glycolysis begins just like it does in cellular respiration. We get that intermediate molecule pyruvate being produced, right? But then the final stages of fermentation are going to look a little different, and there will be no further ATP production once we pass glycolysis, okay? So the final stages of fermentation, there are no ATP molecules produced. Write that down. Okay. So if we were to look at what's happening between both anaerobic and aerobic respiration, we have both of these processes beginning with glycolysis, right? So we're basically trying to break down these glucose molecules in order to get energy, okay? So the initial pathway is going to look the same. We're breaking down glucose. We're going to get 2 molecules of ATP being produced. We're going to get pyruvic acid as an intermediate molecule that's being made. And then depending on whether or not oxygen is available or oxygen is not available, that will determine which way that pathway will continue. Okay, so after pyruvate is generated, if there is oxygen available, this pathway will continue down the path of aerobic respiration in the mitochondria and generate 36 ATP units, okay? However, if there's no oxygen available, this pathway will take a different turn and it will continue down the pathway for fermentation, where our end products are going to be lactic acid or alcohol, okay? So no more ATP is being generated if there's no oxygen available for anaerobic respiration. Okay, so there are two pathways that anaerobic respiration can lead into. Okay, so fermentation, you've heard about fermentation before. There are 2 types. There's alcohol fermentation, and then there's lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so these pathways again are forms of anaerobic respiration. When there's no oxygen present, these organisms will undergo fermentation. As the name suggests, alcohol fermentation produces ethanol, and this is a process that's utilized by bacteria and yeast. Or the process can be lactic acid fermentation, which produces lactate. All right, this is a process that occurs in animals. All right, and so we are able to sort of exploit these properties in organisms and use them for our benefits. So these bacteria and yeast and so forth are how we produce a lot of the food and beverages that we consume. Okay, so we know that glycolysis initiates anaerobic respiration, but then that pyruvate is produced, and depending on the organism, okay, the fermentation can be either lactic acid fermentation, where we can produce cheese and things like soy sauce and so forth. This aspergillus, this is fungi. Lactobacillus is bacteria. Saccharomyces, we can get the production of beer and wine and bread. So these are all examples of food and beverages that we are able to produce by exploiting some of these properties of organisms that in which they undergo fermentation. So fermentation is used to produce these products. I'm sure we have all at some point consumed them before. And so for a point of comparison for both of these pathways, for both aerobic and anaerobic respiration, we'll look at some similarities here. Anaerobic respiration is also known as cellular respiration. This is a process that requires oxygen. It is used by complex eukaryotic organisms in order to generate ATP. The metabolism of one molecule of glucose will yield about 36 ATP molecules being produced. However, anaerobic respiration leads to a process known as fermentation. This process does not require energy and is used mostly by prokaryotes or single-cell organisms, right? That can include both bacteria and yeast, and we're clear that yeast are eukaryotic organisms, but they are unicellular. Anaerobic respiration is not a very efficient process for energy production, which is why it's used by these very simple single-cell organisms, because it only yields about 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. Okay, so again, this is just a schematic for those of us that are visual to compare respiration and fermentation. All right, so the goal here is that we're trying to break down some organic compounds, so the foods that we eat, the carbohydrates, the proteins, fats, whatever our bodies can actually use at that point, with the preferred source being glucose, right? So we have these organic compounds that have to be broken down in order to generate. The process starts with glycolysis for both respiration and fermentation, right? Pyruvic acid is generated as our first sort of intermediate molecule. Now, we already mentioned that there are a little bit more details that kind of goes into what's happening in these pathways, but we're kind of staying on the surface right now just to make sure we understand what's happening. So pyruvic acid are generated, and from glycolysis, we're going to get 2 molecules of ATP being generated. And then depending on whether or not oxygen is present, right, the pathway will actually continue into respiration, or it will continue into fermentation, okay? And we said that in the presence of oxygen, we're going to generate up to 36 molecules of ATP under the most optimal conditions in the cell, where carbon dioxide and water are byproducts that are also generated. If there is no oxygen present, fermentation will commence, and the products will be either lactic acid or ethanol, okay? And so you should definitely spend some time outside of class reading and filling in any gaps that you feel like you may have in this process. But real quick, let's look at this other process of how plants utilize or acquire energy, okay? So we said that animals acquire their energy by consumption of food. Plants are a little bit different. Some organisms, such as plants, algae, or other cyanobacteria, some types of bacteria that are photosynthetic, synthesize organic compounds from inorganic compounds. So we're basically talking about the conversion of light energy from the sun into chemical energy, okay? And so that energy from the sun is then used to convert carbon dioxide into sugars, and that's what's happening during photosynthesis, right? So this is definitely a process that you've heard about before. You've seen the chemical equations for photosynthesis. You should go back and take a look at the chemical equations for photosynthesis and compare that to what's happening in cellular respiration in terms of the key players and what's actually happening. But for the sake of this conversation today, you should make sure you have in your notes that photosynthesis is a process that some organisms, such as algae, plants, algae, and some bacteria, utilize in order to harness the energy from the sun, okay, in order for glucose production, all right? And so that basically happens, this ATP that's being generated here these reactions that generate ATP are oxidation-reduction reactions, okay? I know we're not in chemistry class, but you should certainly understand this kind of on the surface, right? That the cell are using these redox reactions in order to break down we talked about those catabolic pathways in order to break down organic substances in order to extract the energy from it, right? From the nutrients. So the foods that we eat, these breakdown processes that we're talking about are basically the result of oxidation reduction or redox, okay? And so the energy that's released during these redox reactions is trapped in the cell in the form of ATP. So we know that's the usable form of energy in the cell. Okay, and so there's a process known as phosphorylation that you should write down and definitely go and read about. And it basically means that we're adding a phosphate group to a molecule, okay, to a compound. Okay, so phosphorylation is how we get the generation of these ATP molecules during these catabolic pathways that we just looked at, respiration and fermentation. And so what happens during phosphorylation is that we're adding a phosphate to ADP. And so instead of it being 2 phosphates, we're going to end up with 3, with ATP is our usable form of energy. Okay. And so ATP, we know, has high energy bonds that can be broken in order to release that energy into our bodies. Again, this conversation can continue to be quite lengthy, but I just want you to sort of understand the basics here, that the process of glycolysis and electron transport chain and so forth for a cellular respiration, these are redox reactions where ATP is being generated, okay? There are some enzymes that play a role in the production of ATP molecules and cellular respiration of phosphofructokinase, hexokinase, ATP synthetase. If you go out and kind of do some reading, you'll see these enzymes and some others that play a role in these redox reactions. I'm not really going to hold you responsible for the names of any of these enzymes right now, because again, I feel like you'll get a little bit more of this in your upper level classes if you take me for biology and for microbiology. You may get a little bit in genetics. You'll definitely get it in cell biology. So I think right now for principles of biology, you should work on understanding sort of the big picture here for energy releasing pathways and not get so bogged down in the fine details. Okay, so I'm going to actually stop right here. I just wanted to push through this because I have an exercise that I want you all to complete. The exercise is in your